Hi, we're going to talk about aperture. Remember we talked about the three different settings that are on your camera that affect the exposure level. They're part of the exposure triangle, and one of those three settings was the aperture setting. Here we have a couple of photos which show a lens for a camera. It's a 50mm lens. The upper photo shows a big hole in the middle of the lens, allowing a lot of light in. That big hole is the aperture opening of the lens. The bottom photo, as you can see, has a much smaller opening with a tiny amount of light coming through. So clearly the aperture setting on the top being a lot larger, it's going to let a lot more light in and can possibly overexpose your photo if it's too big of an opening. Conversely, the bottom photo with the small aperture opening is going to let a lot less light in to your camera, and if it's too small it could underexpose your photo, not let in enough light. The aperture opening is measured in something called f-stops. Remember we learned about stops being the brightness of light, relative levels, 1 stop, 2 stop, etc. Well, f-stops refer to the aperture size, and it ranges in numbers from f-stop of a 1.4 or 2 and all the way up to maybe an f-stop of 32, or f32 as it's sometimes referred to. It's interesting that the numbers are the reverse of the size of the opening, so the small f-stop number actually refers to the large opening size. So a small f-stop of 1.4 or 2 would match the upper picture, the larger aperture opening. Conversely, if you have a large f-stop number like f32, that actually maps to a small aperture opening, as in the photo on the bottom. So again, f-stops are used to designate the size of the aperture opening, and the smaller f-stop means a larger opening, and a larger f-stop number means a smaller opening. Also, when you go up and down in aperture sizes, or an aperture number, so when you go from an f4 number to an f5.6 aperture, that's going from a little larger opening to a slightly smaller opening, and that change from f1.4 is 1 stop. And remember, 1 stop difference in this case to a smaller opening is cutting the light in half. Conversely, if you do the opposite, if you go from, let's say, a larger f-stop number like f11 to f8, that is changing the aperture opening from a slightly smaller to a slightly larger opening. That gives you more light, and that is a 1 stop difference also, meaning f8, f11 to f8, slightly larger opening, you're doubling the amount of light by making that aperture change from f11 to f8 on your camera. And also apertures can be adjusted in 1/3 stop increments. So for example, if you have a photo that you took that was slightly overexposed, you might want to adjust your aperture setting by only 1/3 of a stop to decrease the exposure, to get a slightly darker photo so that it's not so overexposed. Remember we talked about the fact that besides changing exposure level, the secondary effect of changing aperture is it affects something called depth of field. Again, I mentioned real briefly before, depth of field is what is in focus from near to far, from you and your camera to as far as you can see in the distance. If you have something, we call it large depth of field, that means everything from close to you to far away is in focus. If you have what's called a small or shallow depth of field, then only what's in the area that your camera is focused on is likely to be in focus. Possibly everything really close to you and everything very far from you may be slightly or greatly out of focus. You can see here three things affect how much is in focus, aperture being the biggest factor or setting that affects it. Also, how close you are to your subject affects it somewhat, and a very slight effect is caused by the focal length of your lens. But we're going to focus and stick with aperture opening. A great way to illustrate this is in this set of diagrams here. In the top diagram, actually in both diagrams, you can see the photographer, that's you, standing way over on the left with your camera on a tripod. You're taking a photo of some people in a landscape scene, and you're focusing in both cases on the person where it says best focus point in both of these diagrams here. So your camera is focused, aimed at, and focused on that person where it says best focus point. If you have a very large f-stop number, that will give you a very large depth of field, which matches the top one. So if you have f22 or f32 as your aperture setting, that will give you a large depth of field. So from the leftmost solid red line near you, the photographer, all the way out past the mountains in the top diagram will be in focus. A large depth of field, very large area that's in focus from near to far. That maps to, again, a large f-stop number. Conversely, if you use a small f-stop number, like f2.8, f4, you will get a small or shallow depth of field, as in this lower diagram. So in this case, again, you're focused on where it says best focus point, that person, and only the area within the two solid red vertical lines is truly in focus. Everything closer from the red line to you, the photographer, is going to be slightly out of focus. Everything from the farthest red line all the way out to infinity is going to be slightly out of focus. And again, that's called shallow or small depth of field, and a small f-stop number will give you that small depth of field. So the bottom one is great if you're taking a picture of a person, a portrait, and you have a ugly looking background. Use a small depth of field, a small f-stop number, to have the person you're focused on be in focus and that background be out of focus. The top situation, a large depth of field, is great for a landscape situation where you have maybe beautiful flowers in the foreground, a nice lake in the midground, and in the background you have a gorgeous set of mountains as in the photo here, and you want all of that beauty in focus. Use a large depth of field, a large f-stop number such as f32. And here's actually a set of 3 images that help to further illustrate depth of field. If you look at the leftmost image, we are using a small f-stop number, f4.0, giving us a small depth of field. All 3 photos you can see were actually focused on the middle crocus, the middle flower in the image. And so again, in the leftmost image, we have a very small depth of field. The closest flower is very blurry, the background is very blurry, only the center flower is in focus. Small depth of field, small f-stop number. You move to the rightmost image, and we're using a very large f-stop number, f25, giving us a large depth of field. The front flower is almost in focus, and the middle one's still, of course, in focus, and the background flower is in focus. Way in the background is a bit out of focus. That's just the nature of doing close-up shots like this. So again, large f-stop number gives us a lot more in focus, a lot more depth of field. The leftmost one, small f-stop number, gives us a small depth of field. The middle photo is kind of a middle f-stop number, so it's kind of in between the 2 photos as far as, so it's giving us kind of a medium depth of field, you would call it, using a medium f-stop number. So that's our coverage on aperture and its effect both on exposure level, but also the secondary effect on how much is in focus in your image, which is depth of field. And go ahead and continue on to the next page.